From our panel, Maura Gillespie, founder of BlueStack Strategies and former advisor to Republican House Speaker John Boehner, and Julio Ricardo Varela, journalist and founder of the Latino newsletter. Maura, to you first. Interesting, despite President Trump, as we heard in that clip, referring to the Democrats as crazed lunatics, that this particular snapshot in the poll we were hearing about there chiefly blames the Republicans for the shutdown. Do you think that you are hearing about any concern among Republicans that they are ultimately, going to take the rap for this whenever it eventually ends?
I don't think that the president's language there in that interview was necessarily very helpful. It definitely doesn't encourage conversations to be happening for senators or congressmen, in the House and Senate, respectively. But I think what that poll did show is that the American people have shifted a little bit. October 1st, yes, there were more people who thought that Trump was to blame, but it started to go down. And so people are frustrated that there wasn't a plan by Democrats of how to get out of the shutdown. And as it approaches, days 30, 31, and going into the longest shutdown in history, people are just simply frustrated with how Congress does not work. And we've seen that in the past. I know when I worked on the Hill, it was constantly low approval ratings for Congress at large. And unfortunately, this is going to deteriorate the trust that people have in our institutions here in America to get the job done that they're elected to do. The problem here, too, is that members of Congress are being paid to do this work. Their staff is not. And so I think as we go into this weekend and going into the next, you're going to see some more frustrations with travel but also with paying rent, as was mentioned before. So it's going to be building up into being a bigger problem for members of Congress, for sure.
I'm kind of tired of the sense that people, this is a Republican administration, and if it's the same thing would be happening with Democrats, I'd be saying the same thing. But this is where we are right now.
Let me bring Maura in to respond to what Julio has been saying, Maura, if you would. He's saying, look, the Democrats are not in charge. Does he have a point? Is the onus in this situation on the Republicans to get around the table and, get to a resolution, however that might come?
Democrats chose to go into the shutdown because they wanted to extend Obamacare subsidies that were set up in place during the COVID pandemic. This is set up because the Obamacare system didn't work. It isn't working the way that we were promised years ago. And so the reality in the situation is in 2013, Barack Obama, president of the United States, would not talk to Republicans because they forced the shutdown to happen. Democrats currently have forced the shutdown to happen over Obamacare subsidies. Obama said to my former boss, John Boehner, I'm not willing to negotiate while you hold a shutdown over my head. I'm not going to do that. And ultimately, Republicans lost in that in sense of having to walk back and end the shutdown so they weren't going to cripple the American economy, so they weren't going to hurt families and their children from getting food. And so the reality here is that roles reversed. This is what happened in 2013. And I think it's time for Democrats to realize, I know they're going to wait until after the elections tomorrow. That's probably very clear. Mm-hmm. But after that, It's time to say, okay, enough. Let's have a conversation. John Thune has been willing to put the Obamacare subsidies issue on the Senate floor. So they're ready to have a conversation. It's just time to end the shutdown.
And that whole conversation around Obamacare, healthcare, health insurance, hugely, hugely emotive and controversial, depending on which side of politics you come from. But just more, another question to you, if I may, on what Riley was saying a few minutes ago. She was saying that she doesn't necessarily feel that any of the politicians in Washington are feeling the public pressure on this yet. What is it going to take, do you think, for them to feel that pressure? Is it a question of low-income Americans not being able to put food on the table? Is that what's going to tip the scales?
I think it's travel. You're already seeing some issues there. Yes, the recipients of SNAP run the spectrum of all different types of communities and districts, and Republican, Democrat, deep red, deep blue. So it's going to impact Americans, nationwide, and members of Congress are going to hear from them. So yes, you're going to start hearing that, especially this week. I know that the USDA is releasing contingency funds on Wednesday, but as we get closer to the holidays, as was mentioned, that's going to impact some things as well. But like I said, I think it's also part of this where if members start to feel it, if they start to hear it as they're at the airport waiting for, their flights home for 3 hours in line, they're not going to be too pleased. They don't typically have to deal with these things. They lead, in some cases, they lead a pretty cushy situation. So once they start to feel the impacts as well, I think you'll see some movement.
Okay. How much is this being driven by conversations about what's happening in Nigeria among right-wing circles in the US?
He's heavily influenced
Probably.
by that, and so it depends on
Yeah.
who was talking to him last. It was either Stephen Miller, is my guess. Someone like that who would have been in his ear saying, "You got to do something about this." We did see some celebrities who, thanked him for his speaking up on the issue. I believe it was Nicki Minaj. I could be wrong, but I do think that there is just this idea that if he gets a little attention for it, and whoever was last to speak with him about it, he tends to talk about that issue itself. So,
Right.
yes,
Yeah.
unfortunately, that's the situation we're in.
Maura, what do you make of that argument that there's a lot here that doesn't add up?
I would say it's more so about the fact of transparency. I think that the Secretary Hegseth and President Trump himself have not really explained to the American people what these targeted strikes are doing. They say that it's, to stop drugs from killing hundreds of thousands of Americans. Okay, well then, if we have the ability to stop these boats, then why wouldn't we stop them and, arrest them or take what's on their boats as far as the drugs there? I don't think I fully understand. I don't think the American people have a full picture of what's going on. And so as a president and an administration that promised transparency, I think that's where Americans are questioning and wondering and need answers on. And so I'm hopeful. I know that there was a briefing for senators. It sounds as though it was only Republican senators, but I am hopeful that we'll get more answers in the weeks to come once Congress and once the government's reopened. But it is confusing because right now it looks like a targeted killing of boats that are suspected of having drugs on them.